Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never expected my life to change so suddenly. One minute, I was just living my routine, feeling content with my life. The next, everything came crashing down with a single phone call. It was a number I didn't recognize, and at first, I hesitated to pick up. But something inside me told me it was important, so I answered. A calm but serious voice on the other end asked, "Is this Mrs. Harper?" I nodded, even though I knew she couldn't see me. "I'm from the adoption agency. We've been trying to reach you about your baby." My heart dropped to my stomach. My baby? My mind raced, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" I stammered. The woman hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her voice cold and clinical. "Your husband, Mark Harper, gave up your baby for adoption without your knowledge. We need to discuss this immediately." My world froze. Mark had what? Gave up our baby? He'd lied to me for months. The betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. That phone call lingered in my mind, the words echoing as if they were trapped in my head, replaying over and over. Your baby. Those two words seemed impossible to understand. I paced around my house, trying to process what I just heard. How could Mark, the man I married, the man I trusted with my entire life, have done something so unimaginable? I remembered the excitement we'd both felt when we found out I was pregnant. We talked about what it would be like, names we liked, the nursery we'd decorate, how we'd share sleepless nights together. I thought we were a team, a family. But now, I felt completely alone. The coldness in the woman's voice made it clear. She wasn't lying. Mark had actually gone behind my back and made a decision that would alter both of our lives forever. I couldn't understand why he hadn't told me. What could be so terrible that he felt the need to keep me in the dark? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I was shaking when I ended the call. My mind was a whirlwind, and I could barely make sense of the reality I was living in. I stood there in the middle of our living room, surrounded by the quiet that had once been comforting but now felt suffocating. I needed to talk to Mark, but part of me was terrified of what I might hear. When he came home later that evening, everything felt off. He wasn't his usual self, distant, distracted, avoiding my gaze. My stomach churned as I tried to hold back the flood of questions that were threatening to spill out. He could tell something was wrong, but he didn't ask. I couldn't stop myself anymore. I blurted out, "Mark, what did you do?" He looked at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" I felt my throat tighten. "The baby. You gave our baby up for adoption. How could you do that without telling me?" His face went pale, and for the first time in years, I saw him truly scared. But instead of answering, he walked away. I was left standing, frozen, trying to piece together how everything could have gone so terribly wrong. Mark's silence was unbearable. I couldn't understand how he could simply walk away without even trying to explain himself. Every minute that passed made me feel like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My mind raced back to all the times we talked about our future. Why hadn't I seen the signs? There had to have been something, anything, that could have prepared me for this moment. I confronted him again that night. He sat across from me, his eyes filled with guilt and shame, but he still refused to speak. I could feel my heart breaking with each passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't know how to tell you." His words were a blur, a mix of apologies and excuses, but none of them made sense. He had made this choice alone, without consulting me, without even considering how it might affect me. He had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And yet, he still seemed to believe it was justified. I couldn't look at him anymore. I needed space to think. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, pacing the house, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Mark's words echoed in my mind, but they felt empty. I wanted to believe him, to find some sort of reasoning behind his actions, but I couldn't. How could he think that keeping this from me was for the best? What about our family? What about the life we were supposed to build together? I found myself picking up my phone, staring at it as if it held the answers I desperately needed. I called the adoption agency, hoping for some clarity, but the woman who answered was blunt. I can't give you any more information unless Mark contacts us, she said. The adoption is finalized. I hung up the phone, my head spinning. I had so many questions, so many doubts, but no one seemed to care enough to give me answers. I needed to know more about my baby, where she was, who had her, what kind of life she would have. Mark had taken everything from me, and now he was leaving me with nothing but questions and a broken heart. I couldn't let it go. I had to find her. I had to find the truth, no matter the cost. The next few days felt like I was walking through a fog, unable to see clearly, trapped in my own confusion. Mark had refused to talk further about the adoption, and the more I tried to push for answers, the more distant he became. His avoidance only deepened the hurt I was feeling. How could I have spent so many years with him, only to find out that he had kept such a monumental secret from me? He was the person I trusted more than anyone else, and now it felt like that trust had been shattered beyond repair. But even in my pain, I knew one thing. I couldn't move forward without knowing the full truth. I had to find out where my baby was, who was raising her, and why Mark thought it was okay to make this decision without me. I began to take matters into my own hands. I started researching adoption agencies, calling anyone who might be able to help me track down the child I carried for 9 months. No matter how much it hurt, I had to do this. The days turned into weeks, and the more I searched, the more I realized just how deep Mark's lies ran. Every call I made, every person I reached out to, seemed to lead me to more questions, but no real answers. Mark still refused to acknowledge what he had done, but his guilt was evident in the way he couldn't even look me in the eye. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he tell me everything, but I also knew that I couldn't rely on him anymore. I had to take control of this situation, for my own sanity and for the sake of my child. It was late one evening when I received an unexpected call from a woman named Lily. She claimed to have known Mark for years, and when I explained the situation, she was surprisingly sympathetic. Mark didn't want to do it, she told me quietly, but he felt trapped, and he thought it was the only way out. Her words were cryptic, but they made my blood run cold. What had Mark gotten himself into? And more importantly, what had he been hiding from me all along? I arranged to meet Lily the next day, desperate to understand the full extent of Mark's actions. She agreed to meet me at a small cafe, and when I arrived, she was already sitting at a table, nervously twisting a napkin in her hands. Lily was older than me, her face lined with worry, but there was something about her, something in her eyes, that made me think she knew more than she was letting on. She hesitated for a moment before she spoke. Mark didn't just give up your baby for adoption because it was the right thing to do, she explained. It wasn't that simple. There were other people involved. I felt my heart skip a beat. Who? I asked, almost afraid to know the answer. Lily's eyes darted around the room, as if making sure no one was listening. The adoption wasn't just his decision. There were others pushing him into it. People who knew about the situation and thought it was the best choice. I was stunned. Mark had always been so confident, so sure of himself. The idea that others had influenced him made me feel like I didn't know the man I'd married at all. Lily's revelation shook me to my core. For the first time since the call from the adoption agency, I began to wonder if I had missed something crucial. What had Mark gotten himself into? Why had he involved other people in such a deeply personal decision? I pressed her for more details, but Lily was reluctant to share everything. I'm not sure what Mark has told you, but I know he didn't want to give your baby up, she said, looking down at her hands. He was afraid of losing everything he had, of what it would do to his reputation. He thought this was the only way to fix things. The more she spoke, the more I felt a pit in my stomach. What had he been so afraid of? And why hadn't he turned to me, his wife, for help? Was I not enough for him to trust? The questions swirled around in my head, and I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about the baby anymore. This was about a man who had lied to me, who had chosen to protect his own interests rather than our family. I couldn't just sit back anymore. I had to find out everything. I left the cafe that afternoon with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in weeks. Lily had given me just enough information to make me believe there was far more to the story than I had ever imagined. I knew I had to dig deeper, but the idea that Mark had been hiding things from me for so long made my skin crawl. I needed answers. I went home and searched through every document, every email, every piece of paper that might give me a clue. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon an old envelope, tucked away in a drawer, that things started to unravel. The envelope was marked with the name of an adoption agency, but it was addressed to Mark, not to both of us. I felt my stomach tighten as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated from before I even knew I was pregnant. It detailed the terms of the adoption, the legalities, and, most shockingly, the name of the couple who had adopted our child. My heart stopped as I read the names. These were people I'd never heard of, strangers who now had the life I'd carried for 9 months. I couldn't believe it. Mark had planned this all along, and I had been completely in the dark. My hands were trembling as I held the letter, the weight of it sinking in. Mark had planned everything. He had given up our baby for adoption before I even knew what was happening. I couldn't breathe, couldn't comprehend the depth of his betrayal. I had trusted him completely, and yet, he had made this decision without me. I had carried our child for 9 months, and he hadn't even given me the decency of discussing it. I felt a wave of nausea as I thought about the life we had built, the promises we had made to each other. Was everything just a lie? I spent the entire night replaying every conversation, every moment we'd shared, trying to find some sign that I had missed. But there was nothing. Mark had covered his tracks so well that I hadn't suspected a thing. And now, as I stared at the letter, I realized I didn't even know who he was anymore. The man I had married was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't trust. The pain of that realization cut deeper than anything else. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything except the burning need for answers. Mark was avoiding me, refusing to talk about the adoption or anything related to it. It felt like we were living in 2 separate worlds. His, full of secrets and lies, and mine, shattered by the truth I was uncovering. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could he do this to me? To our family? I confronted him again, this time more forcefully. Mark, we need to talk. Now. He hesitated, but finally sat down across from me. His eyes were tired, like he had been carrying the weight of this secret for far too long. I don't know what you want me to say, he muttered, his voice strained. I did what I thought was best. I thought it was the only way to protect you, protect us. His words made no sense. Protect us? I echoed, my voice rising. You lied to me, Mark. You took away my right to be a mother. How could you think that was for the best? He looked away, his guilt written all over his face. But still, he couldn't bring himself to give me the answers I needed. I was done waiting for him to explain. I was going to find the truth, no matter what. I could feel the tension building between us, like a thick wall that kept growing higher with each passing day. Mark had become a ghost in our home, no longer the man I had married, but someone I didn't recognize. I couldn't live like this anymore, pretending everything was fine when my world had been shattered. I needed to know everything about the adoption, why Mark had done it, who was involved, and most importantly, where my baby was. The anger inside me was consuming. I wasn't going to let Mark control the narrative anymore. I called the adoption agency again, but this time, I was determined to get more information. I need to know where my child is, I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. The woman on the other end was silent for a moment before responding. I can't give you that information unless you're authorized, she explained. But you should know, the adoption is final. There's nothing that can be undone. The finality of her words hit me like a slap in the face. How could something so monumental be irreversible? I couldn't accept it. I couldn't give up on my child, not when I didn't even know who she was with or what kind of life she was living. I had to find a way to see her, to make sure she was okay. I refused to let the adoption be final without at least trying to understand the circumstances surrounding it. I had to know more, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get answers. I hired a private investigator, someone who could dig deeper than I ever could on my own. I gave him the details I had, the name of the adoption agency, the couple that had adopted our child, and Mark's involvement. The investigator promised to find what I needed. I couldn't believe I had come to this point, relying on a stranger to uncover the truth about my own life. But I was desperate. Days passed with no word from the investigator, and I started to feel like I was losing control of the situation. The only thing that kept me going was the thought of my child. I had to know she was okay. I had to know that she was loved. And I needed to hear from the investigator soon, or I would go mad from the uncertainty. It was only a matter of time before I had answers, and when I did, everything would change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigator called. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked up the phone. "I've got some information for you," he said, his voice low. "I found the family who adopted your child. They're living in a small town a few hours away. I also found something else you might want to know." My breath caught in my throat. "What is it?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. It seems Mark had been in contact with the adoptive parents for quite some time before the adoption was finalized, he explained. In fact, he helped choose them. I felt my blood run cold. Mark had been involved in every step of the process, even after I had been kept in the dark. He hadn't just given up our baby. He had carefully selected the family who would raise her. My mind raced. Why hadn't he told me? What had he been thinking? I felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over me, but I knew that I couldn't let it control me. I was closer than ever to finding out the truth, and I wouldn't stop until I had all the answers. The investigator's words replayed in my mind like a constant drumbeat. Mark had chosen the family for our child. It wasn't just the adoption itself that haunted me anymore. It was the fact that he had made that decision without me. He hadn't even considered asking me what I thought, what I wanted. All those nights I spent waiting for him to open up, to talk about the future we were supposed to have, and all the while, he was making decisions that affected both of us without any input from me. I felt a sickening betrayal, and the anger that had been building up in me finally exploded. I demanded that Mark come home immediately. When he walked in, I didn't give him a chance to speak. "You chose them, didn't you? You picked the family, and you never even told me," I shouted, my voice trembling with fury. Mark's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. He had no right to be afraid of me. He should have been afraid of losing me. The silence between us was deafening as Mark stood there, his guilt hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I couldn't look at him. All the years we had spent together felt like they had been built on a foundation of lies. The betrayal was too much. "Why, Mark? Why didn't you trust me with this?" I asked, my voice breaking. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes filled with remorse, but it wasn't enough. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said softly. "I didn't want to put you through the pain of knowing the truth. I thought I was protecting you." His words stung more than I could have imagined. He thought he was protecting me? By keeping me in the dark? By making decisions without me? I shook my head, trying to hold back tears. I would have handled it. We could have figured this out together. But Mark's face was filled with a deep regret. "I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know what else to do." His excuses made me feel even more lost. How could he have chosen this path without even thinking of the consequences for both of us? His decision had changed everything. I needed time to process everything Mark had told me, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Mark's regret didn't change the fact that he had taken this decision out of my hands. I couldn't let it go. The investigator had found the adoptive family's name, and I was determined to meet them. I had to see for myself what kind of life they were giving our daughter. It wasn't about revenge or anger anymore. It was about closure, about knowing that my child was safe and loved. The next morning, I packed a bag and left for the small town where the family lived. I didn't tell Mark. I couldn't stand to face him again right now. As I drove, my mind was filled with questions. Would I recognize my daughter's face? What would I say to the family who had taken her in? Would they be open to meeting me? I didn't know what to expect, but I had to do this. I had to meet them. I arrived in the small town just as the sun was beginning to set, the golden light casting long shadows across the streets. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the address the investigator had given me. It was a quiet neighborhood, full of modest homes with well-kept lawns. As I walked up the path to the house, I felt a wave of nerves wash over me. What if they didn't want to meet me? What if they had no idea who I was or why I was there? I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It felt like an eternity before the door opened, revealing a middle-aged couple, both smiling politely. The woman was the first to speak. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. I hesitated for a moment, gathering my words. "I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Sarah Harper and I'm the birth mother of the child you adopted." The couple's expressions froze. They glanced at each other before the man spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "We weren't expecting anyone." I could feel the weight of their hesitation. This was the moment of truth. The couple invited me inside, though they were clearly apprehensive. The tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't blame them for being cautious. After all, I was a stranger to them, and the situation was anything but ordinary. They asked me to sit down, and I did, my hands trembling in my lap. "We've been told a little about you," the woman said after a moment, her voice still soft. "But we never expected you to come here." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "I understand. I just wanted to meet you both, to see the kind of life my daughter is having. I need to know that she's okay." The couple exchanged another glance, and I could tell they were weighing their options. Finally, the man spoke. "We've raised her with love. She's our daughter now." His words were firm, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. I felt a pang in my chest. "I'm not here to take her away from you," I said quickly. "I just need to see her, to know that she's happy." They hesitated, but after a long pause, they nodded. "Come with us," the woman said, standing up. "We'll introduce you." As we walked through the house, I could feel my heart racing. This was it. I was about to see my daughter for the first time since I'd given birth to her. The couple led me down a hallway to a cozy room filled with toys and soft pastel colors. I could hear the sound of a child laughing in the next room, and my stomach tightened with anticipation. The woman knocked softly on the door before opening it. And there she was, my daughter. She was sitting on the floor, playing with a stuffed animal, her golden hair shining in the sunlight streaming through the window. I froze, unable to speak. She was beautiful, just like I remembered, but there was something different about her now. She was someone else's child. The woman gently called her name, and she looked up, her bright blue eyes meeting mine for the first time. "Mommy?" she asked curiously, her small voice filled with innocence. My heart shattered. She didn't recognize me. She didn't know me. And in that moment, I realized how much I had lost. I knelt down in front of her, my hands trembling as I tried to find the words. I wanted to scoop her up and tell her everything, but I knew I couldn't. She wasn't mine to take. Not anymore. I smiled softly, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. "Hi, sweetie," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm your mommy." The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth, like they belonged to someone else. The little girl looked at me with confusion, then turned her gaze to the couple who had raised her. The woman smiled warmly, putting a hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Sarah," she said gently. "She's your birth mother." The girl seemed to understand, at least in part. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Are you going to stay?" she asked quietly, her small voice so innocent, so hopeful. I had to fight to keep myself from breaking down. "No, honey," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm not going to stay, but I'll always love you." The couple invited me to stay for dinner, but I could barely bring myself to sit at the table. Every moment felt like an eternity, my emotions swirling inside me. I watched my daughter from across the room, playing happily with the stuffed animal I had once bought for her. It should have been me sitting beside her, watching her grow up, teaching her how to walk, how to talk, how to be herself. But instead, it was these strangers who had filled the role I should have had. And it hurt more than anything I had ever felt in my life. As the evening wore on, I felt like a ghost in my own skin. The couple was kind, but there was a palpable distance between us. They were her parents now, and I was just someone from the past. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I needed to leave before I completely lost myself in the pain. "Thank you for letting me meet her," I said quietly as I stood to leave. The woman smiled softly, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Of course. We understand." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion, and walked out the door, leaving a piece of my heart behind. The drive back home felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about my daughter. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable, and I couldn't hold back the tears that flowed freely down my face. I had just seen her, just held her gaze, and yet she felt like a stranger to me. The family had been kind, but they weren't mine. I wasn't her mother anymore. The thought of it tore me apart. I had given her up, and in doing so, I had lost the right to be part of her life. But as the pain continued to consume me, I began to question everything. Was it really the right decision to let her go? Was it better for her, as Mark had claimed? My mind was a whirlwind of doubt and regret. I thought I could accept it, but seeing her, hearing her voice, made me realize just how much I had sacrificed. It wasn't just a baby I had given up. It was my future, my chance at being a mother. And now, I would have to live with that forever. I arrived home to find Mark waiting for me, his face filled with concern. He could tell something was wrong as soon as I walked through the door. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice tentative. I didn't answer him right away. I couldn't find the words. How could I explain to him what I had just gone through? How could I make him understand the pain I was feeling? "I saw her," I said quietly, my voice cracking. "She's beautiful. She's happy." Mark's expression softened, and he reached out to touch my arm. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice full of regret. "I never meant for you to feel this way. I never wanted you to get hurt." But it didn't matter anymore. His apologies were empty. He had made this decision for both of us, and now there was no going back. I shook my head, stepping away from him. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Mark didn't speak for a long time after I said those words. The weight of my accusation hung between us like a suffocating cloud. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of guilt and sorrow, but I couldn't find it in myself to feel sympathy for him anymore. He had taken something irreplaceable from me, and no amount of regret could undo that. "I never meant to hurt you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. But his words felt hollow, like they were just a way to make himself feel better. The truth was, he had made a decision without me, without considering how it would affect me. It wasn't just about our baby. It was about us, our marriage, our trust. Everything had been shattered. "You took away my chance to be her mother," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of those words. "You didn't even let me have a say in it. You took that from me, and now I'm left with nothing." Mark's face crumpled, but still, he didn't know how to fix it. He couldn't. There was no fixing this. I spent the next few days in a haze, barely able to function. My mind kept drifting back to my daughter, to the life she was living with the couple who had adopted her. I tried to imagine what her days were like, who she called mommy and daddy, how she laughed, how she smiled. I wanted to be the one who shared those moments with her, but I had no right to claim that anymore. It felt like a cruel joke, the way everything had turned out. I had given her up thinking it was the best thing for her, and now I couldn't even be part of her life. I was stuck in this limbo, unable to move forward or backward. The pain was suffocating, and it felt like it was consuming every part of me. I tried to talk to Mark about it, but every time I opened my mouth, I found I had nothing to say. I didn't want to hear his excuses anymore. I didn't want to hear about how he thought he was doing what was best. What did best even mean if it left me empty and broken? It had been weeks since I last saw Mark, and I still couldn't bring myself to forgive him. I had tried. Lord knows I had. But the wound he had caused ran too deep. I spent most of my days alone, caught in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't seem to escape. But one evening, as I was sitting in the living room, my phone rang. It was the investigator. My heart skipped a beat as I answered. "I've found something," he said without preamble. "I've located the adoptive parent's contact information, and I've learned something about your daughter." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight with dread. "Your daughter," he continued. "She's been asking about you." My heart leapt into my throat. "What? How do you know that?" The investigator's voice was calm. "The family has been receiving questions from her. She's been asking about her birth mother, wondering who you are." I was stunned. After everything that had happened, after all the pain I had caused her by walking away, she still remembered me. She wanted to know about me. I didn't know whether to cry or feel hopeful. "Do you think," I could meet her again? I asked, my voice shaky. The investigator paused. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. I hung up the phone, my emotions swirling. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for me to be part of her life. The investigator called me back a few days later. He had arranged a meeting between me and the adoptive parents. It was a moment I had been both dreading and hoping for. An opportunity to see my daughter again, but this time, it would be on her terms. I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety as I drove to the address the investigator had given me. When I arrived, I was greeted by the same couple I had met before. Their expressions were still cautious, but there was a softness in their eyes now, as if they understood how much this meant to me. We've spoken with her, the woman said. She's ready to meet you again. But we want to be sure this is something she truly wants. I nodded, my heart racing. I didn't want to pressure her, but I couldn't deny that I wanted this, more than anything. The woman led me to the same room where I had first met my daughter. She was sitting on the floor, her back to the door. When she turned around, her eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. "Mommy," she said softly, almost unsure, as if she was still trying to figure out who I was. My heart swelled with emotion, and I could barely find my voice. "Yes, sweetie," I said, kneeling down in front of her. "It's me. It's Mommy." The reunion was everything I had dreamed of, and nothing like I expected. My daughter was hesitant at first, unsure of how to act or what to say. But as we spent time together, the bond that had always been there slowly started to come back. She was still so young, but I could see pieces of me in her. The way she laughed, the way she held her stuffed bear tightly, the way she looked at the world with wide, curious eyes. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking. I had missed out on so much, but here I was, finally getting a chance to be a part of her life again. The adoptive parents were kind and understanding, but I could tell that they were nervous. They were watching me, waiting to see how I would react. But I didn't want to take her from them. I didn't want to disrupt the life they had given her. I just wanted her to know that I loved her, that I was always here for her, no matter what. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. "I love you," I whispered, hugging her tightly. "And I always will." As the days passed, I visited my daughter more frequently. Every time I left her, it felt like I was being torn in two. On one hand, I was so grateful for the chance to see her again, but on the other, it was painfully clear that I could never fully be the mother she needed me to be. The adoptive parents were wonderful people, and they had given her a stable, loving home, but every time I looked at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding. I wasn't the one who had been there for her first steps, her first words, or the small milestones that had shaped her into the little girl she was. And yet, she was still my child. She was still mine in a way that no one else could ever truly understand. But I also knew that I had to let her go, to let her have the life she deserved. So, every visit became a bittersweet farewell, as I tried to teach myself how to love her from a distance. The more I spent time with my daughter, the more I began to see the subtle differences between her and the child I had imagined she would be. She had a different way of doing things, a different way of reacting to the world. She wasn't mine, not in the way I had once dreamed. And yet, she was still a part of me, a part of Mark, a part of us. The thought of it was overwhelming. But even as I tried to keep my distance, I couldn't help but feel this pull toward her, a connection that refused to fade no matter how much time passed. Mark had stayed distant through it all, and the silence between us only grew. He didn't ask about my visits. He didn't even bring up the adoption anymore, and I couldn't blame him for it. How could I ask him to understand the way I was feeling when he had made this decision for both of us in the first place? It felt like a distant memory now. The happy couple we once were, the shared dreams, the plans for our future. It had all slipped away, replaced by guilt, regret, and an unspoken distance that neither of us seemed willing to bridge. One evening, after a particularly emotional visit, I found myself standing outside the house, staring at the window where I had last seen my daughter's face. I wanted to go back inside, to hold her once more, to tell her that I would always be there for her. But I knew that was a lie. I wasn't her mother anymore. She had a family, a life, and I had to let her live it. It was painful, but it was the only way forward. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, I heard a voice behind me. I turned to see the woman from the adoptive family standing on the porch, watching me. She smiled gently, but her eyes were filled with understanding. "She's happy, you know," she said softly. "She talks about you sometimes. But she's happy." Her words hit me like a wave. I nodded slowly, trying to hide the tears that were welling up. I want her to know that I love her," I whispered. The woman stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "She knows," she said kindly. "She knows, and she'll always remember you." Mark had been distant for weeks. He seemed to avoid me, as though he couldn't face the consequences of what had happened. And I couldn't blame him. I felt the same way. Every time I tried to talk to him about the adoption, about our daughter, he would shut down. It was as though he had already made peace with everything, while I was still struggling to come to terms with the loss. I wasn't sure what had happened to the man I once knew. The man who had held me in his arms and promised we would face everything together. He was no longer that person. He had become someone else, someone I didn't know. I wondered if he had really ever understood the depth of my feelings, or if he had simply made the decision to protect me from the pain. But in doing so, he had taken away my right to make that decision for myself. I felt trapped in a marriage that was no longer the one I had fought for, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay in it. It was late one night when Mark finally came to me, his face drawn and weary. He had been silent for so long that it took me a moment to even recognize him. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't know whether it was out of fear or hope. Part of me had given up on us, but another part still clung to the idea that we could fix this, that we could somehow heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other. He sat down next to me, his hands clasped together in his lap. "I know I've messed up," he began. "I know I've hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I want to try to make things right. I want to be here for you, Sarah. I just didn't know how to deal with everything." His words were a balm to my broken heart, but I couldn't bring myself to believe him. "How do I know this isn't just another lie?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I know you're not just saying this because you feel guilty?" Mark reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I don't have any answers," he said, "but I'm here now and I want to try." The conversation with Mark lingered in my mind for days. He had finally acknowledged the damage he had caused, but I wasn't sure if that was enough. I wanted to believe that things could be repaired, that our marriage could survive the storm we had been through. But the truth was, I wasn't the same person I had been before, and I didn't think Mark was either. The guilt I carried was overwhelming. The decisions we had made together had led us down a path we couldn't reverse. And now, I had to decide whether it was worth it to try again, to rebuild a life with him, or if it was time to let go completely. I knew I needed space to figure things out. But as I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I realized that the most important thing I had learned through all of this was that sometimes the only way forward was to let go, to accept that life didn't always turn out the way we planned, and to find peace with the choices we made, even when they were painful. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, unsure of what to do. Mark had opened up, but I couldn't tell if his words were born of guilt or a true desire to rebuild what we had. The truth was, I was scared. I didn't know if I could ever fully trust him again, and the thought of reopening that wound, of allowing myself to love him again, felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella. Our daughter was still on my mind, her face haunting my thoughts at every turn. I thought about her so often, and the ache in my chest never seemed to go away. I wanted to be her mother. I wanted to be the one who could make her smile every day. But I couldn't have that life anymore. The decision had been made, and now I had to face the consequences. Mark and I were in limbo, stuck in a marriage that had lost its foundation. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living in this emotional turmoil. I needed a decision, one way or the other. I called the investigator again. I needed to know more about my daughter's life, her real life, not the one I had imagined. I had to understand who she was becoming, what she had experienced in my absence. The investigator had promised to keep me updated, but something told me that I couldn't wait anymore. I needed to see for myself. "I need to visit her again," I told him, my voice filled with desperation. I need to see her, to know if she remembers me. Please, can you arrange it? The investigator paused before answering. It might be difficult, he warned. The parents have been very protective of her. But I'll try. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Was it fair to disrupt her life again? Hadn't I already done enough damage by giving her up? But I couldn't stop the pull. She was my daughter. I needed to see her again. I needed to know that she was okay. A few days later, the investigator called me back with the news. The adoptive parents had agreed to a meeting. I was both relieved and terrified. What if they had changed their minds? What if my presence would only confuse my daughter more? But I pushed those thoughts aside, determined to see her again. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building inside me. I arrived at the house early, feeling a knot of nerves twist in my stomach. When the door opened, I was greeted by the same woman who had been so kind during my previous visits. "Come in," she said gently, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. I followed her inside, my heart pounding in my chest. She led me to the living room, where my daughter was sitting on the couch, playing with a puzzle. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her eyes locking onto mine. "Mommy?" she asked softly, her voice filled with innocence. My heart broke in that moment. "Yes, sweetie," I said, choking on my words. "It's me." This time, the reunion was different. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no confusion. She recognized me, and she seemed so eager to be close to me. It was as though the months apart had never happened. We spent the afternoon together, just talking and playing, and I could feel that bond between us growing stronger with every passing moment. But even as my heart swelled with love for her, I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. She had a life now, a life that didn't include me in the way I had once hoped. The adoptive parents had given her everything I couldn't, and I didn't want to take that from her. I didn't want to be a source of confusion or pain in her life. So, when it was time to say goodbye, I held her tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I love you, always," I whispered in her ear. "But you have a family now. You're safe and you're loved. And that's all I ever wanted for you." My daughter nodded, as if she understood. "I love you too, Mommy," she said softly, and I could feel my heart breaking all over again. But this time, I was at peace. She was happy, and that was enough. I left the house that afternoon with a strange sense of closure. For the first time since I had learned about the adoption, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. It wasn't the kind of peace I had imagined, the kind where everything was right and whole again. But it was enough. My daughter was safe and loved, and that was all that truly mattered. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but reflect on everything I had been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain of losing her. It had all been so much. But I had survived it. I had survived because, in the end, I had made the choice to let go. I had chosen to give my daughter the life she deserved, even if that meant stepping away. I didn't know what the future held for Mark and me. Our marriage was still in pieces, and I wasn't sure we could ever put it back together. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to move forward. I was ready to heal, to let go of the past, and to create a future that was just mine. In the weeks that followed, things with Mark became even more distant. He still didn't know how to talk to me about everything that had happened. The silence between us was deafening. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix things, trying to make everything right, but now it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. I had healed some, but I wasn't the same person I had been when we first met. The woman who once believed in fairy tale endings and happily ever afters was gone. In her place was someone more cautious, more guarded, and less willing to pretend that everything was okay. One evening, after another silent dinner where neither of us spoke, I asked him flatly, "Do you even care anymore? About us, about me?" His eyes met mine, filled with pain and regret, but there was no answer. The silence was louder than any words he could have said. I didn't need him to apologize anymore. I needed him to show me that he still cared. But I was starting to realize that maybe he didn't. I made a decision that day. I needed space. Not just from Mark, but from everything. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of trying to hold on to a life that no longer fit. So, I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed a small bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't tell Mark where I was going or why. I just needed to get away. The first place I went was a little beach town about an hour away. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small inn by the shore, but it felt like a refuge. It was quiet, peaceful, and far from everything I had been trying to escape. As I sat on the sand, watching the waves crash against the shore, I allowed myself to breathe again. I didn't have all the answers, but I realized I didn't need them right then. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could hear myself think. I wasn't just reacting to the pain anymore. I was starting to heal. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine in that little beach town. The mornings were spent walking along the shore, listening to the sound of the waves and feeling the cool breeze on my face. The evenings were quiet, filled with solitude and introspection. It was the space I had needed. I wasn't running away. I was finding myself again. I found comfort in the simplicity of life there. No complications, no expectations. Just me. And it was enough. I started writing again. I hadn't written in years, hadn't had the mental space for it. But as I poured my thoughts onto the pages of a journal, I felt a release, as though the words were lifting the weight off my shoulders. I wrote about everything, the pain, the regret, the guilt, the love I still felt for my daughter, and the emptiness that lingered between Mark and me. It felt like therapy, like I was finally letting go of all the things I had been holding onto for so long. One afternoon, I received a message from Mark. It had been a few weeks since I left, and I hadn't heard from him during that time. The message was simple. I miss you. Please come home. My heart ached as I read those words. I had been so angry with him for so long, but now, I wasn't sure how I felt. He missed me. But what did that really mean? Was he just lonely? Or did he truly want to make things work between us? I didn't know anymore. I had spent so much time thinking about our past, but now I realized that I couldn't keep living in it. I couldn't keep looking back at the mistakes we had made. I had to focus on the future, on what I wanted moving forward. I thought about my daughter, about the life she was living. I thought about the woman I was becoming. And as I thought about all of this, I realized something important. I wasn't sure if I wanted to return to the life I had left behind, but I needed to be honest with myself before I could make any decisions. The next morning, I went for a long walk on the beach to clear my mind. I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back to Mark with the same expectations I had before. I had changed. I had learned to value myself, my own needs, my own desires. And that meant I couldn't settle for anything less than what I deserved. I thought about the love I had once felt for him, and how it had been tainted by betrayal. I thought about the future, and whether it was possible to rebuild a life together. The truth was, I didn't know if we could ever go back to what we were. But I was starting to realize that I didn't need to. I could create something new. Whether or not Mark was part of that future, I didn't know. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I wasn't afraid of taking control of my own destiny. The journey to finding myself was just beginning, and it wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to face whatever came next. As I made my way back to the inn that afternoon, I realized that I had found something I had been missing for years: peace. I didn't feel rushed, like I had to make a decision about Mark or my future immediately. I knew that whatever I chose, it had to come from a place of honesty and self-awareness. I couldn't keep running from the truth, and I couldn't keep holding on to something that was no longer serving me. That night, I sent a message to Mark. I'm coming back, but I need time. Time to figure out what I want. And time to heal. His response was immediate. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my own life. The uncertainty was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating anymore. I was starting to trust myself again, and that was the first step toward healing. I returned home after a week, feeling different, more centered. The house felt strangely empty. Mark had been silent, waiting for me to return, to make the next move. But as I stepped through the door, it felt like I was stepping into a new chapter of my life, one where I wasn't bound by the past anymore. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew I was no longer afraid to face the truth. I had spent so much time trying to avoid the pain, to pretend that everything was okay, but now I could finally see things clearly. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. His eyes were tired, but there was something softer about his expression now. "I missed you," he said quietly. "I know I messed up, but I want to make things right. If you'll let me." I didn't know how to respond. I had always wanted to fix things between us, but now I wasn't sure if that was still what I wanted. I had changed, and I needed to be honest about who I was becoming. We sat in silence for a long while, the weight of everything between us hanging in the air. Mark had said that he wanted to make things right, but could I trust him again? Could I believe that he truly understood the depth of the hurt he had caused? My mind wandered back to our daughter, to the choices that had led us to this point. I had sacrificed so much, and for what? For the hope that one day, Mark and I could return to the life we had before everything fell apart. But now, I wasn't so sure that life was something I still wanted. The idea of rebuilding it with him felt impossible, as though the foundation had cracked beyond repair. Still, there was something in Mark's eyes, a desperation, an openness, that made me hesitate. He hadn't given up on us. But had I? And if I hadn't, could I ever learn to forgive him and myself enough to try again? After several long conversations over the next few weeks, I came to a realization. There was no going back to who we were. The woman I had been when I first married Mark was no longer me. And the man he had been when we first met was no longer the man I had loved. We had both changed, shaped by the experiences we'd been through. Our marriage wasn't something we could fix in a day, a week, or even a year. It was something we had to rebuild from the ground up. But that didn't mean it was impossible. We had the chance to create something new, to forge a relationship based on honesty, respect, and, most importantly, healing. I wasn't sure if we could do it, but I knew that I wasn't willing to give up on myself. And that meant I had to give myself permission to move forward, whether or not Mark was by my side. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid to take it. I had faced the hardest part, accepting that the past was gone. Now, I could look to the future with hope, knowing that I was strong enough to face whatever came my way.